Hi, my name is Andrew Roberts, and this is my presentation on the vulnerability assessment of the server systems that were created by Mosfaq Ahmed. This presentation was created for ISA 4220 in the spring of 2018 for Kennesaw State University. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to touch on several topics. First, I will discuss the vulnerability scoring scale that is used to build metrics that determine the severity of each vulnerability. Next, I will describe the state of the services that were installed on each server. Then I will touch on the methodology that was used to evaluate each server and its current state in security. Next, I will present the assessment findings that show the vulnerabilities that existed on each server. And I will then suggest remediation recommendations in which will show the solutions that are available for each vulnerability that was detected. And finally, I will give an overall summary and give a professional evaluation and opinion on where to go next with these servers in a production environment. The scale that was used to rank the severity of each vulnerability is known as the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It is an open framework that communicates the characteristics and severity of software vulnerabilities. It consists of 3 metric groups: base, temporal, and environmental. The base group represents intrinsic qualities of each vulnerability. The temporal group reflects the characteristics of a vulnerability that change over time. And the environmental group represents the characteristics of a vulnerability that are unique to a user's environment. Within the base metric group, there are exploitability metrics. They are based on attack vectors, attack complexity, the privileges that are required, and the user interaction. The impact metrics are based on the impacts that it has on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And within the base metric group, there's always also a scope that describes the depth in which the vulnerability is able to affect systems. This typically explains how a vulnerability is able to break out of its sandbox and influence systems that it should not be able to access. The temporal metrics are based on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They are used to kind of express the exploit code maturity. This is to say that over time, as an exploit gets recognized and built against, the longer an exploit is known to be in the wild, the less likely it is because there's more of a chance for systems to be patched. The remediation level is an explanation of how easy it is to patch such a vulnerability. And the report confidence describes the confidence the analyst has in what a vulnerability is trying to accomplish and the confidence in knowing that this is what the vulnerability was designed to do. The environmental metric group is very user-specific. This is almost an optional group that is applied to a vulnerability once you are going to analyze how it affects a particular system. These metrics typically only are applied to one organization and how the vulnerability would affect an organization. For example, if an organization operated specifically with a lot of SQL databases, then a SQL database vulnerability would be considered of higher priority than it might be to some other companies that don't have databases at all. And these can also be applied to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements of an organization. For instance, a medical facility would have a much higher responsibility to maintain confidentiality because the information that's held within medical facilities is typically more susceptible and more desired to be protected at a higher level. The common vulnerability scoring system uses metrics, and these metrics are typically assigned by an analyst that likely was part of the team that discovered the vulnerability. The base equation computes a score ranging from 0.0 to 10.0. This score is calculated from two sub-equations. The exploitability subscore is derived from base exploitability metrics. These are metrics such as the attack vector, the attack complexity, the privileges required, and the user interaction. Then there's also the impact subscore. That is based on the impact the vulnerability has to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The temporal scores are specific to one point in time. These scores may vary, and depending on when a vulnerability was discovered, a score is likely to change over time and as more patches are released that address the vulnerability. Environmental are typically specific to one location, and they involve industry specifics that are typically aligned with the organization and how the vulnerability impacts the daily operations. In this next section, I am going to evaluate the current state of the required services as they were installed on the server systems of Masfak Ahmed. I will overview this table and describe the scenarios and current state of each service as I go. This first table is representative of the Ubuntu Linux server. First off, the firewall was configured and it was operational. However, the default input chain policy was set to accept, and this essentially created a firewall that was ineffective. There was not a rule at the end of the firewall to drop all packets, which might be a way to possibly mitigate the issue if you were choosing to go with an accept default policy. However, it is always best practices to go with a default drop policy and then open the ports for the services that you require to operate the server on a daily basis. The HTTPS service was installed and operational. This was using the Apache service. The ports were open. Obviously, the firewall was open to all ports. The HTTPS protocol was encrypted. However, the HTTP protocol was still unencrypted and was not being blocked by the firewall. So unencrypted traffic may still be released over HTTP if the service were so to choose HTTP over HTTPS. The Dovecot service was installed and it was operating with the POP3 protocol. It was not operating over POP3S, therefore it was operational, and of course the ports were open. However, this service was not using a SSL certificate, so it was not encrypted. The SMTP service was installed via the postfix application. The ports were open, of course, and the SSL certificate was installed on the SMTP service. However, this was using a medium strength encryption and still had its issues of its own. The IMAP service was operational, and yes, the ports were open. This was also using the Dovecot application. However, there was no SSL certificate installed to the IMAP service, so this was not encrypted. The DNS service was using the bind application within Linux. It was operational. The port was open. However, this service was not encrypted. The database that was installed on the Linux server was using PostgreSQL. The database was installed and the ports were open. However, this was not encrypted. The AppArmor Media Access Control service was installed and operational. This was an internal service, so there was no need for open ports or encryption. The profiles had about 17 that were enforced and 33 that were just set to complain mode. SSH was installed and used the OpenSSH application service. The ports were open, and SSH was using an encrypted connection. As I move on, these will be the required services that were required to be installed on the Microsoft Windows server. The firewall was operational. The ports were fairly well opened. There was no block rules, and it's a firewall, so there's no encryption. The HTTPS service was operational. The ports were open. However, the HTTP service was not being blocked, so this was also being let out of the firewall, and since it's HTTP, this was not an encrypted protocol. HTTPS was operational, and that service on port 443 was encrypted. The SMTP service was not installed on the Windows server at all, so there was no ports and no encryption. The DNS service was installed. The ports were correctly open. However, DNSSEC was not installed, so this was not encrypted. Next, I will move on to the methodology that was used to assess and test these server systems for known vulnerabilities. First off, there was Nmap port scanning tool. This was used to target the servers directly and locate installed services via open ports. This would scan all the ports on the system and report whether certain ports were open if a service was installed on that port. And it also helps test the firewall for properly configured and open ports. If a service was installed but was not getting through the firewall, this system would report it as blocked. Next, we used the Nessus vulnerability testing tool. This tool used plugins to scan systems that were specific to test for known vulnerabilities. Each plugin was designed for specifically known vulnerabilities. These tests would generate extensive reports labeling the vulnerability that was found and essentially list what service and port was in use and was creating the vulnerability on that system. Nessus was also capable of using the vulnerability scale, the common vulnerability scoring system, and this would rate the vulnerabilities based on the metrics discussed earlier. Next, we manually would log into each system and evaluate the IP tables rules that were set on the Linux system. And for the Windows system, we would log in and view the Windows firewall rules and see if the Windows firewall was both enabled and rules were in place to either block services or allow the services that needed to have open ports. Next, we used the AppArmor media access control system. So to verify this, we would manually log into each server, or just the Linux server, and view the AppArmor system. We would generate a report of the status of AppArmor, and this report would list the profiles that had been loaded and what the state was in, if it was set to enforce or complain. Finally, I looked at certain services and checked the versions of each service as it was reported through the systems and through the Nmap scans. These versions I cross-referenced against known vulnerability databases to determine if there was any vulnerabilities that may affect the current version of those services. Now we'll move on to the assessment findings that were the results based upon the detected vulnerabilities and analysis of the installed services on each server. I have chosen to list these based upon rating, and I will start with the critical rated issues. First off, the most important was the improperly configured firewalls on both systems. The Linux firewall was in the worst shape with that lack of a default drop policy on the input chain. Due to the fact that this default policy was not set to drop, and there was no rule set to drop all packets other than the rules above it, this effectively rendered the firewall completely ineffective. The Windows firewall was a little better configured. This is likely due to Windows firewall being designed to kind of configure itself by default. It had properly configured ports for all the services that were installed on the system. However, there were several services that weren't required for the server to operate, and these services were not being blocked in the firewall. For one example, there was HTTP enabled on the Windows server, and this was not a required service on the Windows system. So this was not being blocked in the firewall, and therefore would allow this service to go out across the traffic in an unencrypted state. The next most important, this is likely equally as important as the firewall issues, was the fact that there was critical security patches missing from the Windows system. There really wasn't any reason for these not to be patched, as patches have been available. These two critical vulnerabilities left the system open to arbitrary code execution with system privileges. They allowed S-channel attacks, as well as severe vulnerabilities in the http.sys and the HTTP stack. Next, I will move on to the results that received a CVSS rating of high. These were all found on the Linux system. However, all of these could have been easily patched with installing available security patches for the services that had been installed and also patching the Linux system itself. These issues left the system vulnerable to arbitrary code execution and denial of service attacks. Some of the affected processes were PHP, curl, the Ubuntu release upgrader, the Linux kernel itself, and a list of about 8 to 10 different drivers that were susceptible to vulnerabilities as well. These were common drivers for USB devices and stuff like that. And all of these could have been easily patched by just running standard updates. Finally, I will go over the issues that had a common vulnerability scoring system rating of medium. First off, the Linux system had several SSL issues in which they were pretty much resolved if an SSL certificate was purchased and assigned to the services from a reputable certification authority. However, two of these, the certificate trust issues and the self-signed certificate, were on this system by design. We did not purchase certificates, so this could be remediated, but this was likely on there based upon the choice of the system. However, one of the SSL certificates on the SMTP service of the Linux box was configured with an invalid hostname. Next, there was a vulnerability on the Linux system in which DNS snooping would allow for remote information disclosure. This was because the DNS server was not set to deny recursive queries, and this could have been easily resolved. There were several patch vulnerabilities, Perl vulnerabilities, and Apache 2 vulnerabilities that existed on the Linux server. In addition to these, there was also 2 speculative execution vulnerabilities, which are also known as Meltdown and Spectre. These vulnerabilities allow for an attacker to access the memory of a system, and this is especially worrisome because this can be done outside of software, and it breaks a big distinction between the 2 separate levels of an operating system. Next, the Windows server had similar issues with the SSL certificate, but this was installed on the HTTPS service. It also found SSL version 2 and 3 detected. This could have been resolved by enforcing TLS, preferably 1.2 or higher. The SSL certificate that was installed on the HTTPS service was also signed using a weak hash algorithm. This could have been resolved by enforcing a strong encryption when creating the self-signed certificate. And this would also be resolved if a strong certificate was purchased from a certificate authority. Finally, there was an SSL version 3 vulnerability, and this was existent in the HTTPS stack. And this essentially would allow an attacker to decrypt information by asking for 1 bit of a 32-bit packet, and the server would return 31 bits, and this would allow an attacker to essentially decrypt an encrypted connection. Many of these vulnerabilities could have been resolved by simply choosing the proper protocols to implement or installing strong services that support good encryption and good security. Many of these could also just be patched by running routine updates on several of the services. After reviewing the majority of the issues that reside on both the Windows and the Linux server, there were 4 main recommendations that would have resolved the majority of the issues. First, being the most important, was to have a good patch management system in place. Several of these vulnerabilities existed simply because the servers had not had the most recent security updates installed on the operating system themselves, as well as patching the service packages. This is extremely important because these are well-known vulnerabilities that are often exploited, and to have the remediation readily available and ignored was simply bad practice. Next, the firewall needs to have strong enforcement. These rules need to be outlined ahead of time so that services are specifically allocated and it is very clear which services need access outside of the perimeter of the system itself. These firewalls need to be carefully configured so that only the services that are required for daily operations are available to anything outside of the server system itself. Specific policies need to be applied that drop any packets that aren't the expected services. It is also advised to implement selective rules that help safeguard against denial of service attacks, replication attacks, amplification attacks, rather, and even sign flood attacks. All of these rules can easily be added to a firewall that add a great level of security and shut down attackers before they even access the operating system itself. Next, there was several services that were apparent on these servers. The required services had been outlined, however, the firewalls and services were either not disabled or the firewall was not configured to block these services. It is very important to limit each server to the services that are required. This makes the attack surface as small as possible and easier to manage because you're not worried about attack vectors that are outside of the installed services that are allowed through the firewall. Finally, there was several encryption issues in which medium encryption was used and SSL was used over TLS, whereas there may be services that do still require SSL, and you might want to enable that kind of fallback availability so that if TLS isn't supported, they can roll back to SSL. However, this does create a larger attack surface and allows attackers to find available vulnerabilities in SSL. It is also very well advised to use strong encryption algorithms to create these certificates. It is essential to use at least 128-bit encryption or higher, and if possible, pay a little extra from the certificate authority to make sure that those encryption certificates are secure to a point where they will stay secure for several years to come. Finally, I would like to do a type of real-world overview to summarize the information that was contained in the presentation thus far. Essentially, firewalls are the doors that lock out attackers. The more doors you leave open, the more entryways an attacker has to access the system. An effective firewall will only have doors open that are required for the services to operate, and essentially you can put security measures in place to guard each of the open doors. However, if you don't know that doors are open, then there's no way to put a security measure in place to monitor it, and therefore you're leaving yourself susceptible to attacks. Next, security patches are essentially readily acknowledged security vulnerabilities, and these are often found within the software and operating systems that we use on a daily basis. Thankfully, as soon as these are publicly disclosed, it is very often that the creators of these operating systems and software systems go quickly to work to resolve these issues because they want to make sure that the people that are using their products are feeling safe about the products that they offer. However, if you make the bad decision to not install the security patches that they carefully develop to fix the issues that they find, then you're essentially making a bad decision to ignore the advice of these software developers that notice the security issues, and they release these patches to ensure that the customers are safe. However, if you ignore this, then you are choosing to maintain a safe environment for yourself. The medium strength encryption issue is thus similar to having a very long and hard to guess password. Password strength is very important to security, and just like a strong password, a strong encryption makes it very difficult, if not impossible, in a short amount of time to guess the passwords that are being used to exchange this sensitive information. Essentially, the use of strong encryption creates an extensively long randomized password that is only known by the two systems that are communicating, and often only one piece of the password is known by each system. This way, the systems can communicate, but never really share their passwords with each other. And just like as a strong password, a tough to guess password is always better for security. Finally, the lack of enforcement on the servers is essentially showing that you have put security measures in place, but then you're not really holding anybody accountable for them. I would compare this to maybe putting a guard at a front door, but then maybe having a back door that does not have a guard, and that one guard is expected to somehow watch both doors at the same time. And this is essentially an unlikely expectation, and if you do not enforce a system in a way that ensures that every door to the system is carefully guarded, then you're essentially choosing to leave your system susceptible to an attacker to gain access to the sensitive information that's held within. Finally, it After evaluating the state of the servers and understanding the issues that existed on each server, it would be my professional recommendation that these servers are not suitable for deployment in any production environment. These servers would need to go, obviously, they would need to go through a patch management phase in which all the high and critical vulnerabilities were addressed. Several services would need to be disabled so as to not leave these vulnerabilities open. And it would also be beneficial to force all of these encrypted services to use a very strong encryption. And the enforcement of encrypted protocols would be necessary so that unencrypted protocols such as STPS and POP3 and IMAP that were installed were not able to access the outside world unless they were in an encrypted state. At this point, I would like to thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope the information provided was beneficial and gives insight into these server systems and how we will approach these scenarios moving forward. Hopefully my professional opinion is valued and my recommendations are carried out, and eventually these servers, with following the guideline recommendations, will be in a production ready state and everything will be operational, and at that point we can reevaluate the state of these servers and move forward from there. Thank you for listening to my presentation. This has been a presentation for vulnerability assessment in ISA4220. This presentation was presented by Andrew Roberts. Thank you.